Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast, where we explore natural homeschooling, gentle parenting, simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Family Mentor, coming to you from an island in the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my hilarious husband and 3 growing sailors in our fixer-upper on the beach. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. This is episode 87, and today I'm here with Sarah Peyton talking about self-compassion. Sarah, neuroscience educator, certified trainer of nonviolent communication, and constellation facilitator, integrates brain science and the use of resonant language to heal emotional trauma, increase resilience, and nourish self-warmth with exquisite gentleness. For so long, I was feeling blocked in the creation of a sage parenting course that I felt so called to create, that I knew would serve all of the families I was supporting so well. And then I had the epiphany that it was not, in fact, a sage parenting course. It was a sage mothering course. With that shift, everything opened up and the course is now flowing to life. I feel like I am sparking with a new aliveness for all that this will bring all of you sage families. If you want to be one of the first people to gain access to this new program when it's ready and all of the goodies I'll create around it, opt in at sagefamily.com/sage-mothering. Welcome to the show, Sarah. Will you introduce yourself and share a bit about who you are and what you're passionate about?
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you, first of all, for having me, Rachel. My name is Sarah Peyton, and my world is the integration of how we use language and how that impacts our brains, especially how it impacts our brains after we have lived through difficult events that leave us with intrusive memories of them. So in the way therapists use language, they often say that's a PTSD experience where you have a remembering of a memory and it just shoves its way right in, or an old shame memory comes up, or there's this experience of you're having a conversation with me, but you suddenly start thinking about something that happened in 1972. You wouldn't be alive in 1972, but I was.
Love it. Okay, this sounds like such important work. We talk a lot about all of these kind of threads that weave throughout the work that you put out there and the things that you're passionate about. So I am super excited to dive into this. And let's start with unconscious contracts. What are they? How do they block us? How do we release them? Give us all the good stuff.
When we grow up without a lot of a sense that there are like people right with us who understand us and who have our back, then our brains try to make up rules that help us to survive, having been in a situation without a lot of support. So a brain tries to make support for us, and it says, okay, I'm never going to speak aloud in public again, so that I am not humiliated and ridiculed, no matter the cost to myself. And it's like a rule that our brain makes up. Or I will believe that I am ugly and bad in order to make sense of the way my mother treats me. Or I will believe that I shouldn't be alive and that I am a burden in order to lighten the load on my beloved mom. Kinds of things like this, where we make rules for ourselves that we don't even really know that we've made, but then we end up following for decades. After we've left our childhood homes, we're still so longing to save our mothers and make sure we're safe in our childhood homes where we don't even live anymore.
Yeah. So it's kind of like we talk a lot about narratives here, and it seems like it's kind of similar to a narrative, but perhaps like deeper, like they're unconscious, so we're not even aware that they're there. How do we bring them into the light to work with them?
Yeah, and they are a little like they're a little like a narrative that we know, because so like a plant has a flower and it has roots. And the flower is, I will believe that there's something wrong with me. But then the root, that's the unconscious part. So we're conscious of the narrative that we believe there's something wrong with us. But because we're so often discouraged from thinking relationally, we don't usually know how enormous hearts we had when we were small, and how much we loved the people that we were living with, and how much we wanted to make things better for them. And also, of course, they might have been so dangerous. We don't even know that. But so hidden in the ground at the base of this narrative that we are a bad person is the root of like all kinds of things that can be made from love. I will believe that I'm bad in order to make my mother right. Mm-hmm. I will believe that I'm bad in order to be like my father so that he's not alone. I will believe that I'm bad in order to make sure that there's enough attention and love for my sibling who's struggling. So many ways that we can have that the story, that the root is an unknown, unconscious, deep love.
That's beautiful. It sounds like that language, in order to, can kind of help us like get at the root to that flower. When we have these beliefs, these stories that we're playing out, and we can kind of invite ourselves to go a little bit deeper with that in order to, like, what did that narrative serve?
Exactly. Because a lot of times we just think, oh, I'm just bad. It's just true. Mm-hmm. I'm just a bad person. And then we go, I will believe I'm bad in order to, oh, there's a reason that I'm believing I'm bad. And it's very different.
That's a powerful invitation. Okay. Resonance is something that you talk a lot about. Will you help us understand the concept of resonance?
So I'd be delighted to. The concept of resonance is a little like an understanding that human bodies are a bit like cellos. I have a cello in the back of my space here. And when you have one cello and you're playing it beside another cello, and the second cello begins to vibrate softly with the same music that's being played on the first cello. And our bodies are just like that with emotions. So in some way, even though you and I don't even know it, we are resonating with each other. We're resonating with each other in terms of we're talking about the same thing. We're interested in each other. I'm wondering how the words that I'm saying are landing for you. I'm aware of your facial expressions. You're tracking your audience. But you're also tracking me. These things are all happening at a level that we're kind of tracking. But at a deeper level, our bodies know much more than we know consciously about how each other are doing. Our torsos and our throats are particularly vibrational for emotional understanding of one another. And we move through the world without even knowing that our bodies are vibrating with the people that we meet. And whoever we pay attention to, we're actually inviting our bodies to vibrate with them.
Reminds me of polyvagal theory, and that we're always sort of like pinging, almost like a radar for safety, and picking up on all of those frequencies, like resonating with the frequencies of everyone around us.
Yes, I love polyvagal theory.
I love that language, resonance. It's beautiful. And that metaphor of the cellos, I'm going to bring that with me as I move forward, because that's a beautiful metaphor. I can almost hear it in my mind. Okay, self-warmth. How does self-warmth have healing power?
Well, self-warmth is immensely integrative. The thing that stops us from being with the world as it is, now we would first have to agree that being with the world as it is our best possible option, which is hard because the world as it is not particularly an easy place to be with. There are so many places where things are not what we wish they would be. We're in the middle of the 6th great extinction. We're watching climate crisis happen day by day, where crises happen day by day. We're we're looking at systemic oppression and global inequalities on everything from vaccines and healthcare to food and safety from the extreme heat that's a part of global crisis, climate crisis. So it's not an easy place to be with. So there are many people who would be like, no, I don't want to be with the world as it is. Thank you very much. I will play my video games and I will watch my Netflix and I'll be just fine. Thank you very much. And in between, I'll go to work and I'll pay my mortgage and get my kids to school. And but then there are others of us who find that being with the world as it is very much a part of being with each other as we are. Very much a part of presence and mindfulness and love and being able to have real, grounded, and rich relationships with each other. So how does self-warmth help with this? Well, I don't know about everybody else, and I don't know about you, Rachel, but I don't like to be with the world as it is. but I do want to have relationships with the people around me and the people that I love. So it's a bit of a struggle in here in my mind. And the thing that calms my mind more than anything else is a gentle voice that's saying, of course, Sarah, of course you struggle. Of course you don't want the world to be the way it is. Of course you worry about the animals and the species and the plants and the earth and the soil organisms. Of course you love the people that you meet. Just like a little voice that's just like going, yeah, you're having your experience and it's a real experience and it has emotional overtones and here they are and they make sense. It's a kind of a self-accompaniment that makes it very much sweeter to be alive and helps a lot with preventing trauma, emotional trauma, makes us resilient to stress, helps us with presence.
It reminds me of like the reparenting work that we often talk about, sort of like mothering your inner child in the same ways that we advocate mothering the actual children in your arms. Like a lot of validation and acceptance and making space for all the feelings that are completely normal to come up and the hardnesses of being human.
Yeah, exactly. Because our prefrontal cortex, there's a wonderful neuroscientist named Moshe Gif. He's a epigeneticist who works in Montreal. And he works a lot with the impact of emotional trauma. And he says, our mothers are in every cell of our prefrontal cortex. So we have 86 billion cells. Our prefrontal cortex is about 2.8 billion cells of that 86 billion cells. And I don't know if I have my numbers exactly right. It's not exactly a third. It's less than a third. So less than a third of 86 billion. But we have billions of mothers in our brains. And our billions of mothers are recreating what our first original mother did with herself, even more than what she did with us. It's kind of surprising, but we model our brains after our birth mothers or after the mothers who raise us, our adoptive mothers, perhaps, our mothering people. Or if our father was the most involved, then we'll model our brain after him or the grandmother. It doesn't have to be the mother. It can be anybody who's taking care of us. We model our brains after them, and they might treat us far better than they're able to treat themselves. And then we go, my mother treated me just fine. My father treated me just fine. Why is the inside of my brain such a nightmare? And then one day we wake up and we go, oh, this is exactly the nightmare my father lived with. Oh, this is a nightmare my mother lived with. And they were able to change things radically for us, but they still carried those scars from their own trauma. And we carry them too. It's second generation trauma. Transgenerational trauma, it's called.
So it's like we're mothering our inner child, we're mothering our present self today, and then we're mothering the echo of our own mothers within our own cells, within our own heads.
Yeah. And we get to upgrade the mother within us. We get to sort of move toward a sense of our mother's essential self as the part that gets to mother us. Like if our mother were completely supported, if she had gotten to receive her remothering, if she had gotten to heal her emotional trauma, if she had gotten to live with resonance and self-warmth, what would she be like to us? How would she be in relationship to us? We get to bring that being, that essential being, in to become the mother that we carry in our less than one third of 86 billion cells.
When my own mother passed away, I went through this exercise to help bring some healing for myself, where I imagined that in this transition, she was freed from all of the things that got in the way of her being, her truest, fullest, most love-centered self. And I sort of wrote myself a letter in her voice, like apologizing for the things that I needed healing around, or just bringing some clarity from her, like I'm projecting, through her perspective. And it was so profoundly healing. And still, I think of that letter often, and I'll revisit it, that like trying to embody that version of the mother. I mean, there were many wonderful things about her, but to be able to, in sort of that soul transition, like shed a lot of the things that got in the way and be a more truer version. That's something that's been powerful for me.
What an inspirational example. That's wonderful.
Thank you. Okay, what is neuroplasticity and why is it significant?
Neuroplasticity is, and to everybody who's reading, if you're enjoying this, there are several books called Your Resonant Self and Your Resonant Self Workbook that are part of this wonderful exploration of this work. Neuroplasticity is our brain's capacity to change. So when I was little, some 57 years ago, the world said, adult brains are not neuroplastic. You have the experiences you have for the first 3 years of your life, and then you're toast.
Locked in.
That's right.
Learning and growth, done.
Done. Absolutely. Whatever happened the first 3 years, set in stone, nothing else happens after that. You just have to live with it. Oh dear, what a depressing point of view. And then as I got older, they started to discover that human brains change significantly with all kinds of learning. Now we can have a traumatic experience and our brain neuroplastically responds by creating trauma loops or unconscious contracts. But we can also have positive experiences that change the brain. And one of the things that's happening as we work with emotional healing, as you do with your audience, and as I do so much also, is that we are growing new neurons between the right prefrontal cortex and the right amygdala in particular, that are the neurons of the fibers of attachment. They are what create secure and earned secure attachment for people. So the more that we have, like a little chain of neurons in there that are going, of course, Rachel, you make sense, the more your attachment is secure. Mm-hmm. And that neural chain, that chain between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, is the most neuroplastic, the most amenable to change and growth of any neural tract in the human brain. It's so changeable. It's so happy to change and grow that it will change and grow when somebody is 90 years old and they finally get into like a nursing home that's sweet, where people are taking care of them and telling them that they love them and giving them kisses on the head. Their whole brain will change in response to being treated with warmth. Of course, that would all be consensual. If they said no, they did not want kisses on the head, then there would not be kisses on the head. But whatever kind of experience it is that creates trust and a sense of mattering and a sense of being held with warmth grows these neurons in between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And I like to think of these neurons as kind of a permaculture garden of neurons, that we're growing an ecosystem of self-care and self-warmth and self-resonance that just becomes more and more complex with time.
That is so beautifully hopeful. I was watching this video just the other day, this study where I always love and I always make a point to go into studies that pair like older folks living in nursing homes with really young children. Like I anytime I see a study pop up of that, I'm like, oh, I want to wade in because it's always so good. I was just watching a video about one the other day, and they were sort of highlighting their findings with like this one specific older gentleman who had a lot of challenges throughout his life, and then this really young boy who was being raised by a single mother and had no extended family. And the two of them just bonded so deeply, and they both experienced so much healing. And that was just sort of this nice example that came to mind as you were talking about that.
When I read those, I always think, when I am old and in a nursing home, I hope somebody lets me have a friend who is a little child.
Me too. Oh my gosh, me too. Okay. What you refer to as default mode network sounds kind of like our inner narrator. Can you introduce us to the DMN?
Mm-hmm. For many years, the scientists, starting in the decade of the brain, the 1990s, scientists all over the world got fMRI machines so that they could start to look at human brains. And they would be looking at the human brain and asking the human brain to do something like, let's have you do an algebra problem and see where that happens in the brain. And then there would be a 1 to 2 second sort of little break in between the algebra problems. And they would see this pattern that they just thought was white noise. All the scientists all over the world, they were just like, that's white noise. Brains have white noise. They're just like television stations that are tuned to a non-existent channel. I don't know. You had the experience of white noise on your television. I did, because I am younger. I'm older than you. And then one day, about 10 years in, it took the scientists about 10 years, and they said, oh my God, Rachel's white noise is just like Sarah's white noise. And Sarah's white noise is just like Brian's white noise. And Brian's white noise is just like Angela's white noise. And oh my God, this is not white noise at all. This is a network that all human brains revert to when they're not doing something focused externally. So this is, then they said, this must be the default mode network. This must be the network that the brain defaults to when it's not doing something intentional. And it's most alive. We hear it most right when we wake up in the morning and when we go to bed at night, when we're not doing anything, before we've started to do something or after we've finished doing whatever it is we're doing, or if we're doing something like washing dishes or taking a shower. And what your brain is doing at those moments is it's running a program that all humans run that allows us to consider ourselves in the context of our world. So our default mode networks are kind of ping-ponging around inside of our brains, pinballing around, ding, 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 going from place to place, looking for dropped stitches, really, more than anything else. And also, we can use our default mode networks, and artists learn to use their default mode networks to kind of ride on for creativity. The default mode network is alive when we're daydreaming. It's working when we're night dreaming. All of our night dreams are the default mode network sewing our lives together. I think of the default mode network as a sort of an automatic tailor that's in there, just kind of sewing the pieces of life together. Now, when we've lived through trauma and we have not been accompanied and our trauma has not been healed, then those are the big stitches that the default mode network is trying to pick up. And it's trying to use those unconscious contracts to sew us back together. So it's trying to use whatever idea it is that we've developed about ourselves that might help us understand the world. I am stupid. I am ugly. My body is wrong. I am clumsy. I am crazy. I am not enough. I am too much. All of those narratives are the thread that the default mode network is trying to use to sew us into a whole self. This is excruciatingly painful for people, because if the needle is the thread and the needle are going in and out, I'm so bad, I'm so bad, I'm so bad, I'm so bad, I'm an idiot, I'm an idiot, I'm an idiot, I'm an idiot, then the default mode network is not a fun place to be. It does not make our brain an easy place to live in. The default mode network, when it has been traumatized, it makes the brain a very hard place to live. And I'm just having a little moment of sadness about how hard it is for everybody who has complex PTSD, who has unhealed trauma, who has intrusive memories. And also, I have a sadness that we think it's truth instead of knowing that it's trauma.
Yeah.
But as we heal, the work of Ruth Laney is so amazing. Again, another Canadian neuroscientist working out of. I went and saw her in Calgary, but I don't think she lives in Calgary. But her work shows that when we do trauma healing work, the default mode network changes. That we can actually look at an fMRI of somebody's default mode network and tell whether they're living and reliving PTSD. It's like the default mode network keeps circling through the amygdala. It doesn't go anywhere else. It doesn't get to go anywhere else and do creativity. It doesn't get to go anywhere else. It just keeps trying desperately to resolve the trauma. And so
stitch it together.
To stitch it together and to use that narrative that's so destructive. This is happening to me because I'm bad. I'm bad. This is happening to me. If I weren't bad, this wouldn't be happening to me. This is happening to me because I'm bad. And it's just a constant refrain that people need to find some way to escape from. And all of our addictions help us to escape from a destructive default mode network. And all of our compulsions help us escape from a destructive default mode network. First-person shooter video games are the most effective activity that we can participate in that makes the default mode network fade out.
Interesting.
Yeah. And cigarettes also help the default mode network fade out. Those two in particular, those are the most effective ways of escaping a crazy default mode network. Dissociation helps. All of the things that we traditionally think of as harmful to us, all the things that we're traditionally trying to heal in regular psychotherapy or in healing work, are simply the after effects of these unconscious contracts that we're trying to use to sew ourselves back together after difficult events. And difficult events do fragment our brains.
Yeah, those are our coping strategies.
Yeah.
Okay, will you introduce us to the right and left hemispheres of our brains?
The right and left hemispheres of our brains are not symmetrical. They are different in many ways. They look like they roughly might be symmetrical. And the things they occupy themselves with are in similar areas. So, for example, on the left side of the brain, we have a couple of areas that are occupied in everyday speech and everyday listening. And in the right side of our brain, we also have areas that are occupied with speech and listening, but they are occupied at a much deeper level with meaning and aliveness and relational connection in the context of the way that we use language. Now, many people say this is complete BS. The two hemispheres of the brain are both always working. And it's true, they are both always working, but they're looking at life in slightly different ways. The two different hemispheres run on different neurotransmitters. The two different hemispheres have different neural structures. The the neurons of the left hemisphere have short little Tyrannosaurus Rex arms that only reach to their neighbor Tyrannosaurus Rex. Whereas the neurons in the right hemisphere have very long arms that reach all the way across the brain sometimes. And so throughout the animal kingdom, everybody who's got a vertebra has a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And throughout the animal kingdom, the right hemisphere actually weighs more than the left hemisphere because these neurons have more neuron body than in the left hemisphere. And so for example, if we were a pigeon, we would use our left hemisphere to tell the difference between a piece of rock and a seed. If we were a pigeon, we would use our right hemisphere to scan the environment for predators and figure out where to fly next and look down and see where might be a good place to gather food. Left hemisphere, details. Right hemisphere, big picture. Left hemisphere wired to the right hand, tools. How do we grasp and move the world? Right hemisphere wired to the left hand, relational gesture. How do we indicate some sort of connectedness? This shows up very early in infants. They can see this in the very first months of an infant's life, that their left hand is used for relational gesture, that their right hand is used to grasp objects. We are profoundly lateralized. And at the same time, we are profoundly complex. So everything is happening everywhere all at once. I love that movie. And and as this happens, we shift between being able to see the big picture and being able to track the details, and see the big picture and track the details, and to see other humans as infinite beings, and to see other humans as tools who will help us get things done. Oh, I'm having a podcast with Rachel. Maybe some people in Rachel's audience will enjoy the work that I'm doing in my mission of reaching people so that they get to have more comfort inside their brains will be accomplished. Yeah. Oh, I'm having a podcast with Rachel. I'm enjoying that she smiles at me, and I like it when she laughs. And I wonder, and I love the little hints that she drops about the work she does in the world. So do you see both things happening? And the more that we get to integrate both sides, the more effective we are. We get to be relational, and we get to take action. If we're just taking action without relationship, we end up in a pickle where, for example, we're using so much fossil fuels that we're, without any thought for the whole system of the world, that we're pushing our world into climate crisis. That is action without big picture thinking. We live in a world where we're very often pushed toward action without big picture thinking. And then in addition, to make this picture more difficult and more complex, the same place in the brain that does big picture thinking, the right hemisphere, is also the place where unhealed trauma lives. So if people are going to try to get into big picture thinking, they're going to have to deal with a lot of emotion that they've been able to avoid by playing their first-person shooter video games or controlling the world and taking all the fossil fuels and making good profits off of them.
So that integration is a key piece, which, like, it seemed over the years, as I've looked at all of the different literature about left, right hemisphere, that whole conversation, like integration is always the word that I bring with me forward. And I love that, like, you're bringing that back out again.
And my favorite authors on this are both Ian McGilchrist, who did the book The Master and His Emissary, and the new book, The Matter with Things.
Okay.
And also Alan P. Shore, Dr. Alan P. Shore, who's written 4 very thick books on the right hemisphere in psychotherapy. Really fun.
Okay, cool. And by the way, for those listening, we are going to add all of these fun resources in the show notes. So you don't have to try and, if you're driving, you don't have to try and pull over and write it. I promise I'll pile them in a nice, easy list for you. Okay, body-centered awareness. How can we build a body-centered awareness?
Body-centered awareness is the awakening of a part of the brain called the insula, which is located, remember, we're talking about the neurons between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. In between the prefrontal cortex and amygdala, there's a little brain body called the insula that's a part of the inner cortex of the human brain. And the insula gives us the capacity to read our body sensations for emotional experience. It also gives us a sense of what we have disgust about. And it turns out healthy disgust is incredibly important for us to be able to have boundaries and to know what to say yes to and what to say no to. Disgust is often a sort of a dirty word in our world, but it's incredibly important for it to be an alive accompaniment to our daily walk through the world, so that we know, in a way, so that we know what to do, not to get overwhelmed. Overwhelm is one of the most common words that people use for their emotional experience these days, which makes sense considering the speed of the world and all of the information that's available. Of course, people are overwhelmed because they're trying to take in more than they can, or they're trying to do more than they can, or they're trying to be more imaginative than they can be, or more feeling than they can be, or more responsive than they can be, or more responsible than they can be. We're living in a world that is like a fire hose instead of a stream that we can sip from. So our capacity for healthy disgust lets us go, oh, that's too much for me. I'm going to take a break from this right now. I'm going to have a nap. Healthy disgust lets us nap. It lets us turn away from things that are terrifying. It lets us have a little rest from worrying about the fate of everyone that we meet. Well, it's a very good thing. I got distracted with healthy disgust. Where were we, Rachel?
That's okay. Body-centered awareness. I mean, I definitely see how that ties in. I think so often one of the well-intentioned messages that particularly a lot of mothers receive is sort of like that judgment is bad. So anytime you feel like judgment, like that's bad, you're bad for judging or feeling a judgment. And what I have found is that like the pendulum swung too far the other way, such that anytime we become aware of a feeling in our body that's signaling that something is not right for me, like that, oh, there's something that I get to see, that I get to learn from, that doesn't feel right for me. We're shutting it down before we can sort of like really sit in that wisdom.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So then that body-centered awareness and what you've just said brings me back to the insula. When we've been raised in a family that doesn't talk about body sensations and doesn't allow for this kind of wisdom that you're mentioning, doesn't allow us to learn our lessons about what we really like and don't like and what feels good and doesn't feel good, then the insula remains dark. It learns to be dark in order not to provide distressing and untended messages. And it turns out that having a dark insula makes us very vulnerable to post-traumatic stress.
Makes sense.
It does. We find it very difficult to heal from trauma if we don't have any access to our bodies, because our body is telling us exactly what you mentioned, what things have been traumatic and what needs to be healed from. With the dark insula, without any body-centered awareness, we don't know what we need to heal from. There's no starting point. There's simply the intrusive memory that's torturous and just keeps running, and that we need to dissociate in order to be able to manage, because we don't have any other tools to begin to grow the permaculture garden of neurons.
Yeah. Oof. Okay. How does loss of accompaniment determine whether or not an experience is a trauma?
So my definition of the word trauma is any difficult experience during or after which we were alone. We were not accompanied. The reason accompaniment is important is because that permaculture garden of neurons that says, yes, Sarah, you make sense, is grown by overlapping experiences of actual people saying to us, yes, you make sense. A lot of parents don't have the resources to be able to say to their kids, yes, you make sense. They're so overwhelmed themselves and nobody told them that they made sense. So their children don't actually make sense to them. They're like completely bewildered that their children are having temper tantrums. They're completely bewildered that their children are disobedient or have a reactive response to the world, or are shy, or struggle with focus. All of these things make their children bad instead of them saying, oh, how does my child make sense? Mm-hmm. This is another kind of transgenerational trauma, because if we didn't make sense to our parents, it's very difficult for our children to make sense to us.
Yeah. It's almost like it's very easy to get stuck in the left brain where we're trying to solve the problem, when really we need to make more space for the right brain to integrate and just accompany our children in whatever the experience is that they're having and the feeling that they're having.
Yeah. And it's hard, like easier said than done. I mean, I've been working on this stuff for so many years. I have a 24-year-old. When he tells me he's distressed, I'm not like, oh, tell me the flavors of your distress. I'm like, let's fix it. No, don't think about it that way.
My left brain wants to be the captain and rescue them from their distress.
Yeah, no feelings. Let's not have any feelings.
I am the Coast Guard. I am going to rescue you from this completely.
That's right. Yeah, but of course that doesn't help our child's brains to have the resilience that they need and to be able to have their insula be awakened, be able to name their body sensations and connect them with feelings. So there we are. We're setting our children up for non-resiliency when they really need it's just, to be accompanied so that they have as much resiliency as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, how does the present orientation of the amygdala provide an opportunity for healing?
This is about our brains. There are so many things I mourn about human brains. But what I love about human brains, and it's very weird because it's what fires post-traumatic stress intrusive memories, is that the amygdala has no sense of time. It does not actually know that the shame memory it's currently recycling inside of one's brain is from when we were 3. It's like now. It's like we are in trouble right now. We're remembering something that happened 57 years ago, and we're like, I'm in trouble right now. This is really bad. I'm a bad person. I did this when I was 3. There's no consciousness of I did this when I was 3. There's like, I'm a bad person. I did this. This was bad. I was thinking the other day, I was walking and I was like, oh my God, when I was 6 years old, I let my aunt's beloved parakeet out and it disappeared forever. And just like a totally distressing memory, from when I was 6, and it came with crushing shame. And I was like, oh, here we are. Here we are. My amygdala does not know that I am 60 years old. It's like you are 6 years old and you had just lost your aunt's beloved parakeet. That's what the amygdala does. But what's so cool about that, even though, of course, it's incredibly distressing to live with intrusive memories, is this means that our memories, our difficult memories, are always available for accompaniment. Yes. So we can step through time and space. Rachel and I can step to 6-year-old Sarah, who lost her aunt's parakeet. We can hold her hands and say, do you need acknowledgement of how devastated you are? Do you love your aunt so much? Do you love her more than anybody? And is it just a horror to you that you've lost her beloved friend?
And we'll love you through it, and we'll move through it together.
Yeah, yeah. But
Yeah.
yeah, staying with resonance.
Yeah. I think this time traveling thing is so powerful because, like you said, we all tend to be so familiar in like a lived experience way of the like one side of the coin, which is that, when I wake up in the middle of the night, like people bring the war home with them, right? Like like I mentioned, my mom passing, there was a lot of trauma around it. And in the middle of the night tonight, I could wake up and be back in that space and that time, like no time had passed. But like you said, I love that we can make people aware of the flip side of that coin, which is that because the amygdala is so in the present, we can respond to the trauma as though it's happening now and heal that trauma. We can accompany ourselves or get the accompaniment we need now and do that work as if it was happening.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's very beautiful.
Okay, last question. How do the circuits of emotion and motivation work?
Well, this is the work of Jaak Panksepp, who was an effective neuroscientist, and his co-researcher, Douglas Watt, who is still with us. Jaak Panksepp passed on about 3 or 5 years ago, and Douglas Watt is still with us. And they worked on developing an understanding of the different pathways that different emotions travel. They discovered that there's a different pathway in the brain for anger, a different pathway in the brain for fear, a different pathway in the brain for love, a different pathway in the brain for grief, and that each of these different pathways is almost like as if we could think of them as like an underground, the London Underground or the metro system in New York City, that there are these different trains that travel on different tracks. We just need to complexify it slightly by saying that the train that's traveling on the anger track runs on a different fuel than the train that's running on the seeking track. Mm-hmm. So that the train running on the seeking track is run by dopamine. That's its fuel. That's the neurotransmitter. That's the main neurotransmitter in the tissue that our energy and information is flowing in when we're trying to do work or solve a problem or answer a question.
Motivation.
Yeah. Dopamine. Different track than if we get angry. Then it's neurotransmitter P and glutamate. There we are. Boom. Whole different neurotransmitter picture. That train is a different train. It's running on a different track and it's running with a different fuel. And so with each of these different neural pathways that are the circuits or the systems of emotion and motivation, there's a different experience. And this is important for a number of reasons. One of the reasons it's important is because people sometimes think that they don't have an anger track. Mm-hmm. Or that they don't have a sexuality track, or that they don't have a seeking track. And everybody's got everything. This is a prerequisite for a human brain. These tracks are laid in quite low in the brain. They're very basic. They're the pathways that our most basic energy and information flow upon. Now, cognitively, we do all kinds of things with those neural pathways. But the more that we're aware of them and the more that we have warmth for them, the more ease we have with moving between train to train to train to train, which is what we want. We want to be in a responsive relationship with life, not reactive, not automatic re-jerk reactivity, but thoughtful, creative responsiveness to our life experience. And so the more that all of these circuits accompany us and have the capacity to do their job for us, the easier our lives are. The easier it is to heal, the easier it is to parent, the easier it is to be responsive to our children's circuits of emotion and motivation.
Yeah. I'm thinking of, like the neurodiversity perspective where someone, for example, with ADHD they don't have as much dopamine, flowing along those lines. So it's like harder to get that train going and harder for it to pick up speed. Like it's a nice metaphor to get to bring along to understand even like biodiversity, different, like all the different diversities of human experience. Like it's a nice metaphor to help us understand all of that.
Yeah. And then we've got like interactions between all the things that we've been talking about. So for example, somebody who has ADHD has a more intrusive default mode network, which is part of why their intention is more fractured. It's because the default mode network is butting in more. It's harder to stay externally focused, which is part of the reason why video games can be so supportive when people are working with something like ADHD and they find themselves, they're like, how could I have ADHD? I can focus just fine on my video game because the video game is completely disabling the part of the brain that takes you off focus.
Oh man, this was such a nurturing experience. First, let me say you have a beautifully warm soul. There's this like maternal energy mixed with this like wisdom. I feel like I just took a, college course and yet also I just meditated. So thank you for the gift of your resonance that I am picking up. Now, the show notes can be found at sagefamily.com/podcast87, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. And we're going to sign off here, Sarah, by you sharing the resources for people to dive deeper into this topic.
Oh, that's such a lovely invitation. Well, first of all, if you like to read, then there's these wonderful books. The Resonant Self, Your Resonant Self, and Your Resonant Self Workbook. This is the one on the contracts. This is the one I wrote. I wrote this one about self-compassion, and then I was traveling all over the world, and people were like, you make perfect sense, but I can't be compassionate to myself. I was like, oh, that must make sense somehow. And then I developed a whole idea about the circuits that we've been talking about and contracts and why it would make sense that we can't be compassionate with ourselves. If you like to watch YouTube videos, there's a YouTube channel, Sarah Peyton YouTube. And then if you like to take classes or to listen to guided meditations, go to my website, sarahpeyton.com.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It has sincerely been a pleasure.
Oh, I'm so grateful to have been with you, Rachel. It's wonderful to meet you.